And it's really sort of showing in the last decade the extent to which migration and your ability to manipulate the flows of people has become a cudgel for autocrats or aspiring autocrats to try and pressure liberal democratic states that are resistant to massive flows of migrants.
Europe, that is to say, a continent far surpassing the European Union in size and historical depth, is in the midst of several crises, each testing its resolve and resilience in different ways. The political class, to begin with, is no longer trusted to carry out its duty honorably by the majority of European societies. This past week, the United Kingdom has further aggravated this sense of disillusion by providing the latest ethical scandal, or sleaze, in Westminster jargon. A slate of senior Tory members of Parliament, Sir Geoffrey Cox among them, are alleged to have trespassed the limitations on lobbying activities conducted whilst in office. Meanwhile, the European Union keeps careening toward another refugee crisis, although unlike the migrant crisis of 2015, these refugees are unlikely to be portrayed as victims. Instead, they're being funneled to the Polish-Belarusian border from places like Kurdistan and Afghanistan as part of a deliberate pressure campaign. Lukashenko, the authoritarian leader of Europe's pirate state, is allegedly being puppet-mastered by Vladimir Putin to retaliate against the EU sanctions on its eastern neighbors. Finally, the third crisis concerns energy. With Germany's use of nuclear energy expected to phase out in the coming year and energy demand fast picking up, Europe's energy prices are soaring all over, casting doubts over the continent's post-COVID economic recovery and raising the prospect of widespread blackouts this upcoming winter. We discuss this and more in this bonus episode, the 42nd in our series, recorded with Julian Graham, a dear friend of the show. As always, please rate and review Uncommon Decency on Apple Podcasts or the platform of your choice, and send us your comments or questions either on Twitter at undecencypod or over email at undecencypod@gmail.com. And also, please consider supporting the show through Patreon at www.patreon.com/undecencypod. Enjoy the show.
So, in this medley of international headlines or European headlines we will be dealing with this week, I think we want to start with the juiciest and the most embarrassing one, which is the entire Tory sleaze headline. I always love a Tory sleaze, and just the word sleaze is just so funny. Julian, tell us what's going on in the UK. What's going on with Geoffrey Cox? What is going on with the whole Tory sleaze scandal, which seems to be very damaging for Boris Johnson's prime ministership?
Yes, very damaging. In fact, I think there was a poll today showing Labour is only 1 point behind the Tories for the first time in a long time. The proximate cause of, I should say, the latest Tory sleaze, because there are quite a few scandals in the Conservative Party right now, is the MP Owen Paterson, who left government as a minister and took up a job as a lobbyist for a chemical firm called Randox, a health diagnostic firm. And then this company was awarded a contract for COVID testing. And he did all of this while working as an MP. So lobbying the government while working as an MP. And while this is technically allowed, there are very strict standards on it. You're not allowed to use your own office, your parliamentary office, that is, to lobby the government. And Owen Paterson discarded virtually every rule about this. He was lobbying not only from his parliamentary office, he was lobbying using the parliamentary stationery. So he would send letters to the government with his parliamentary letterhead on it. Just total disregard for any of the rules of lobbying. And after a lengthy investigation, during which I should probably mention, as it is used in his defense, his wife tragically committed suicide. When the report was published, the Conservative Party grandees rallied and pressured Boris Johnson into getting his MPs to not only reject the punishment suggested by the report, but also to propose a new commission standard that would be run essentially by the parliamentary majority to investigate allegations of sleaze. So to sort of wrap it all up, Owen Paterson lobbying the government while working as an MP, and the Boris Johnson government's ham-fisted attempt to get him out of trouble has uncorked a ocean of issues, the most embarrassing of which is the former Attorney General, Geoffrey Cox, who has been working for about £900,000 a year for the British Virgin Islands, and in many cases from the British Virgin Islands, which is, I mean, I would work from the British Virgin Islands if given the chance. But if you're representing your MPs in Parliament, that's quite difficult to do. In fact, I think the height of embarrassment for Mr. Cox was this week when sending a letter to explain his absence from Parliament. He sent it from the Mauritius. So it's all right for some, shall we say.
Oh. And how widespread is this? Because there's a few very familiar faces and familiar names, such as Geoffrey Cox, coming up. But it's just a case of kind of very high-profile minority cashing in on their reputation, or is this kind of much more widespread with basically every MP? And there's also, is it something which is limited to the Conservative Party, or is it something that maybe Labour and the Lib Dems are doing, but so far they managed to stay under the radar?
So there's two elements to it. One is that a lot of MPs do have second jobs. I think a fifth declare a second job. And while the most high-profile ones tend to be the grandees of the Conservative Party because they're more flagrant in some of their violations, it is not only the purview of the Conservatives. So Keir Starmer has faced a bit of criticism for his work before becoming leader of the Labour Party, it must be said, but while as an MP doing legal work on the side, and allegations of hypocrisy given his attacks on the Johnson government. But in addition to just a fifth having a second job, about 2/5 declare income from some form of extra parliamentary work. In fact, the most amusing, I think, is the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party, Douglas Ross, who is a part-time football referee, which I think is quite a cool second job to have, and one that would probably endear you to voters. But so this is an issue that's quite widespread because there are no rules preventing you from holding a second job. And it is not just the purview of Conservatives, but they, as the majority in the party and government, and then also the characters, are individuals who've been around for a long time. Ian Duncan Smith, or Sir Ian Duncan Smith, excuse me, I should use his honorific title, as well as Sir Geoffrey Cox, David Davis, all of those Brexiteers and the Tory party grandees are the ones ensnared in the public eye right now, but they are not the only ones cashing in outside of their parliamentary jobs.
Mm. And if I fail to jump in, if you have any questions at any point.
Yeah, no, I think this is really so interesting, and I mean, it would be interesting to sort of see what the regulation is in the UK in terms of what kinds of lobbying activities MPs are allowed to pursue. But I think what is so interesting and what you've explained, Julian, is that you've got. I mean, I think you have a similar story, running along similar lines in other countries of Europe, where the centre-right parties are more inclined to see their members take on lobbying jobs after leaving office, whereas in the far left, for instance, what you have in the center left and the far left, what you have as much as, if not more, is you've got politicians who go on to lobby for NGOs, and that supposedly is a less sleazy way of cashing in on your former government service. But I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter who you're lobbying on behalf of. The reality of it, I think, in most of our countries, is that people aren't paid enough to do politics. They feel like being a politician is a thankless job, and a lot of the times they'll want to end their careers with a higher paycheck, and they go to lobbying or NGOs. And I think what's so interesting is how, I wasn't aware of those figures, Julian. What's so interesting about what you're explaining is how widespread it is that 1/5 of all MPs report an extra parliamentary activity. To me, that is staggering.
Yeah, and part of it, London is a very expensive place to live, as you both know, and commuting into London from your constituency in Cumbria or in the west of Wales or Devon is quite expensive as well, and it takes a long time. And so many MPs, simply to finance a lot of us, will take on a second job just because it's the only way to pay the bills, or at least an easier way of paying the bills. And this is not the first financial scandal to ensnare British politics. Some of you might remember the expenses scandal, when, again, it was both sides, but the Conservatives seem to be a bit more egregious in it, would use taxpayer money and expense home renovations to a truly laughable extent. I think one MP tried to get expenses for his moat around his home. But of course, renovating apartments. Mr. Boris Johnson, our current Prime Minister, got external money to renovate the flat at Downing Street. Now, you could argue that, the Prime Minister does need to have a good home that's comfortable to live in and that he feels confident so he can do the job. But the concerns of how does he finance it? And Mr. Johnson has his own financial concerns with divorce on the horizon and having to pay for that, hence his book deals. But this need for external income, it's a factor. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now, and a lot of congressmen are trading. Nancy Pelosi's quite famous for it, but she doesn't get in trouble for it. But lots of other members of Congress, they trade on information that they get that might be in the public eye, but they're making financial trades to pay for the fact that they have to fly across the country. And it's the same in the UK of it's so expensive to live in London, it's so expensive to travel that MPs simply take on second jobs as the only way to foot the bill for the life of being a member of parliament.
Yeah, but could it just be that in generally, just maybe not just in the UK, but more generally in maybe the West, jobs in politics aren't that attractive. You're not attracting the creme de la creme, the best of the best. And a lot of them are going to the financial sector, going to management consulting, and the kind of, because there's not only but the prestige, but also the kind of financial remuneration you can get in these jobs is just out of the league of politics these days. I guess my question is, at this point, do you think there is going to be a conversation about making being an MP more lucrative, as politically toxic as this might be? Or no, are we just going to see some very small, not very substantial changes and some kind of damage control from the Tory party?
Well, I think the Johnson government would try to stifle any attempt at reforming the present system of outside jobs, at least, given the numbers and influence of those Brexit backbenchers who have all these second jobs. We saw the speed with which they could get the Johnson government to push this Patterson report aside. So I'd be skeptical that they would actually implement any reforms or push for any reforms. I do think the higher pay would certainly be one way to do it. I can't remember which year it was. It was during the Cameron government, but MPs, there's an independent pay standard and they keep upping how much MPs should be paid, in part because of the cost of living in London. And MPs, every time they have to vote on this, sort of get up on the cross and refuse to give themselves a pay raise while wages are flat in their own constituency. And it's kind of shooting themselves in the foot. But I think higher pay, and it's not necessarily just in Parliament. I think one example from Singapore, their civil servants get paid high six figures, low seven figures if you're the top civil servant at the Ministry of Economics or the Ministry of Trade. And that's how you hire the best talent away from the global consulting firms, the global law firms, the global banks, is to simply just pay people more. So it's an attractive career to go in. With politics, I don't think you could get away with paying MPs £500,000 a year and then telling them not to lobby. I don't think any voter would go for that. But you could up the pay and then expense certain items such as travel and housing in London alone, or simply make it easier to work remotely so that they can vote remotely and therefore spend more time with their constituents. But to your point on whether it's attractive, we've seen this twice now in the last 5 years, the tragic cases of MPs being killed doing the fundamental service of constituencies, first with Joe Cox and then this year with Sir David Amess. Not just the vitriol that you get in social media from people, the constant press attention on your life, but now the very real danger of physical harm. Being an MP is becoming a harder and harder job, and the quality of people that you will get is going to decline the harder it gets, because why would you make that sacrifice knowing not only that your mental health is on the line, your personal relationships could be under stress, your financial situation could be under stress, but also your life could in some ways be in danger unless you're a minister with security details. So it's a problem that needs to be addressed, whether it's with higher pay, but I don't think the Johnson government will push on it, but it's something that should be done for the benefit of the country, because you're just going to get worse people in government and it will spiral into bad governance and probably catastrophe. You could argue even not having the right people in place is part of why Britain's COVID response initially was so terrible, because we just didn't have the right people in place.
Yeah, and there's also this whole transparency push, which has made the private and personal life of MPs put under a lot more scrutiny, and which is something you will not see as much in the private sector. I want to bounce back on a point that Jorge made, which I thought was quite interesting. Right-wing politicians and left-wing politicians have a very different approach to politics. I think right-wing politicians treat it a lot more like a job. And they're in office or they're not. And if they're not in office, they're going to try and make as much money as they can. They've got a career to think of. And I think left-wing politicians also have a career to think of, but they're much more in this kind of Gramscian vision of politics. And they will be a lot more involved in education, a lot more involved in NGOs. They will try to find alternative ways, if they're not in office or when they are in office, to kind of shape the public debate. And I thought it was actually really interesting that a lot of politicians, even kind of middle-aged politicians who could still technically have a career in politics, are now deciding to leave the political sphere because they no longer think their ideas can win on that area alone. And I was really struck actually to see a lot of, most of my examples are French because that's kind of what I follow the most, but in the past 2 years, there's 4 or 5 high-profile left-wing politicians who have decided, like 40 or something, to leave politics. Cécile Duflot, she was a Green MP. She was a minister under François Hollande. Benoît Hamon, who was the socialist candidate in 2017, has decided to leave one NGO as well. And there's so many of these examples, and it's kind of really striking, I think, about how left-wing politicians think about politics these days.
Yeah, and that in some ways goes to the heart of the divide between the left and the right in their approaches to politics. I mean, I'll speak for the British Conservative Party, not necessarily others, but the British Conservative Party changes its fundamental views once every 15 to 20 years, because for them, politics isn't about principle, it's about power. And what can you get done in order to stay in power? I mean, Boris Johnson's economic strategy right now with the Chancellor Rishi Sunak would have been anathema to the Thatcher era Conservatives, and indeed just to Cameron. I mean, Cameron with the age of austerity. And Conservative parties and politicians are constantly reinventing themselves. And so they can morph between someone who is working as a minister, then loses that job and goes straight into lobbying, knowing they might well return to government, because for them, it's more about being in a position of power than necessarily enacting a principle that you've campaigned on your entire life. Whereas I think for left-wing politicians, and I might be generalizing a bit here, the exception, of course, to this is Tony Blair. It's more about what do you believe, and we have to get this done because it's the right thing to do, not we have to get this done because we want to win the next election. And you see, Tony Blair gets a lot of vitriol for his work after Parliament, and he somewhat rode back on the advising foreign governments with questionable human rights records. But he went straight into the lobbying industry rather than working on the non-profit side.
I can hear Corbynists shout at their podcast application right now saying Tony Blair is not left-wing. Julian, before we move on to a more bleak story, I think, with Belarus and Poland, do you have any kind of fun, sleazy anecdotes you can share before we move on?
Oh, gosh. This is going to get me in trouble with my former friends at CCHQ. I mean, the main one, of course, is all the holidays that every MP takes. So your MPs are supposed to, if you're going on holiday, typically speaking, the joke in the thick of it was that you had to go on holiday within the UK because no one in your constituency would want to see you having fun on Mallorca or in Miami or, just sort of on an island in the middle of the South Pacific. Boris Johnson probably takes some of the best holidays of any recent prime minister. I mean, he's been on holiday to Miami and then recently at Zach Goldsmith's villa in Spain. The main benefit of this, of course, is that Zach Goldsmith is a member of the House of Lords. So he doesn't have to declare this as a gift. It's just him staying at the friend of a very, very wealthy MP who actually used to be my MP, in fact. He was kind of an interesting character because he could just pay for everything out of his own pocket. So he never actually had any sleaze scandals because he was just so rich that it didn't really matter. He didn't need any money from CCHQ. He paid for all his campaign materials. He paid his staffers extremely well. it's probably quite a good MP to work for. But no, I'm afraid I don't have any sort of salacious stories that haven't reached the pages of the Mirror or the Times.
Well, before we move to Belarus, I think you're pointing out one risk of MPs not being paid well enough is, any kind of ambitious lower class student or just anyone will not be attracted by that career because he's not going to be able to sustain himself in the way that a Zach Goldsmith could. And I think that's definitely a risk.
Yeah, and one thing that was pointed out, it was an article by Kezia Dugdale, who's the former leader of the Scottish Labour Party, is that a lot of these MPs with second jobs are older, they're from the sort of safer constituencies where they don't really need to run the risk. But the red wall Tory MPs, for whose constituents earning £100,000 a year as your second job is an obscene amount of money, are not going to take this well at all. And so there is a generational divide as well as a geographic one. But within the Conservative Party, the younger MPs from the red wall, who are the future of the party, then they're going to be much more critical of this sort of thing and probably pushing for changes in the future.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, one of the. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when under Ed Miliband's leadership, there was a very routine line of attack that you would hear Prime Minister's questions every Wednesday, and Ed Miliband would say, the Tories are the nasty party. They're the party of austerity. They're the party of Eton College. They're the party of the Bullingdon Club. And I think one of the more interesting shifts that you've seen in the UK over the past 4 to 5 years since Brexit, essentially, is that you're seeing a realignment of the social extraction of Tory politicians. You're seeing far more Tory politicians, as you said, from the red wall, who are not your Bullingdon Club member, who are not your sort of entitled brats from wealthy southeast, from the wealthy southeast of England. You're seeing far more diversity in the career paths and the walks of life from which the Tory party is recruiting its candidates. You're seeing people from mid-sized towns from the north. And I think that's one of the more interesting. I mean, the face of the Tory party, I think, is changing massively.
Yeah. Your podcast with Mr. Nick Timothy, I think, probably talked about this in far better detail than I ever could.
Yeah.
Since
we have to thank you for this one because I remember prepping it with you back then. But let's move to Belarus. Just one thing, Julian mentioned the thick of it. The thick of it is the equivalent of Veep. It was actually the inspiration behind Veep, the TV show, and is hilarious. If anyone has time on their hands, look it up on your YouTube or whatever. The thick of it is hilarious. Now, let's move on to something which is a bit less hilarious, which is the whole history between Belarus and Poland, where Belarus has essentially been throwing migrants on the Polish border. Jorge, can you kind of walk us through the story?
Sure. Well, I think listeners of our show may remember we dedicated an episode to Belarus a few months ago with Vlad Davidson and Hanna Lyubakova. We essentially called the episode Europe's Pirate State. And that was shortly after Lukashenko, who has been ruling Belarus like a tyrant. He essentially sent his state security forces to hijack a blogger who was flying from Athens to some other European capital, and I think the Baltic states. I think they were Lithuania, right? Yeah. He was flying over Belarusian airspace, and Lukashenko sent his thugs essentially to arrest this blogger and
he sent a fighter jet, to force a plane to land in Minsk.
Exactly. So we dedicated an episode to this, and we called it Europe's Pirate State. And essentially, at the time, what really struck us was here is a European country, obviously not a member of the EU. Lukashenko is very much, very warm to Vladimir Putin, very close to Russia. I don't think there's any sort of serious talk of accession to the EU in Belarus's case for now. But here's a European country, at the very least, which is essentially acting in like a pirate in the international stage. In terms of international law, Belarus has been really very much sort of a rogue actor. And this is just to kind of set the tables up for this other act of piracy, essentially, which Belarus has been undertaking with Poland. This is, as Francois mentioned, there's been several thousand migrants camping outside on the Belarusian side of the Poland-Belarus border. And the allegations are that Belarus has been essentially calling for migrants from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan also, to essentially, to come up against the Polish border, and essentially using these migrants as a tool of hybrid warfare. And that's what I found so interesting, is that this is not the first time that the EU is subject to having migration. I mean, in fact, another episode that we dedicated to migration a few months ago, it was a bonus episode, and we talked about essentially a similar thing happening between Spain and Morocco. Morocco was in the Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla, which are these two tiny cities in Morocco that belong to Spain. Morocco was essentially using migration as a pressure valve. It was, essentially funneling migrants into Ceuta and Melilla as a way to exert diplomatic pressure on Spain, because Spain had given medical attention to a Polisario activist. So this is, I mean, long story short, this is just to say that, our podcast covers European issues as a whole. And I think we're seeing migration become really a tool of international conflict. We're seeing rogue actors like Morocco and Belarus use migration against the EU. And one of the more interesting things is that what I found really interesting in this whole saga is that the EU has been pretty coherent around Poland. Poland has been asking for the help of EU member states to patrol the EU's external border. Let's just remember that Poland is a member of Schengen, and once these migrants make it into Poland, they're free to move essentially to any other country that is a member of the Schengen space. But what I think has been pretty remarkable this time around is that EU member states have been pretty coherent in rallying around Poland, and Poland is being supported, I think, generally by all member states. But what I have seen, and I'd love to get Julian's thoughts on this, is that the UK is one of the few countries to have actually volunteered its police or the military. I forget what it is, but they're volunteering servicemen and women to go to Poland's border with Belarus to patrol it and make sure that there are no breaches of that border. So I know that the UK, since Brexit, has been kind of recasting its international alliances, and a huge part of that, I think, is the UK has just a very, very deep relationship with Central and Eastern Europe, countries like Poland. I think there are ties of trade, but also migration that go far back, decades. And so I thought it was really interesting. Maybe you've got some thoughts on this, the fact that the UK was supporting Poland in this conflict.
So I do actually have an interesting anecdote about this. In 2015, while I was working on the Conservative election campaign, shortly after the Tories won, it was the Polish election in which the Law and Justice Party came into power. And I remember at CCHQ, a lot of the Conservatives who were following, because there are strong ties culturally with there are a lot of Poles in the UK, of course, people were very happy about the Law and Justice Party taking power in Poland. So there is a political link there to the parties. And then today, of course, a shared affinity for stronger borders and enforcement of the borders. The British decision to send troops there is very much in keeping with support for Poland. Britain wants to put a military base in Poland. It's a very important country for the British in terms of their foreign policy, both in terms of their strategy towards Europe and then also their strategy in balancing against Russia, who is identified as sort of public enemy number one in most British security manuals. This situation with Belarus, it was interesting you mentioning the Spain and Morocco one, which is one I was not aware of, but it sort of makes me think a little bit to Turkey and the EU's payments to Turkey to try and keep migrants there as opposed to crossing over into Europe. And it's really sort of showing in the last decade the extent to which migration and your ability to manipulate the flows of people has become a cudgel for autocrats or aspiring autocrats to try and pressure liberal democratic states that are resistant to massive flows of migrants.
Absolutely. And I think that the key part about what you've just said, Julian, is that I think rogue states like Turkey, like Belarus, and like Morocco are well aware that they can funnel these migrants and use migration, as you said, as a cudgel of conflict, because they know that the electorates and the people within the liberal democratic states have are sympathetic to the plight of migrants generally. So they can use the image of these downtrodden, badly clothed, badly housed migrants. They can use the image of that as a moral cudgel. Yep. They can make liberal democratic states seem, in the eyes of their own electorates, as they can essentially create a sense in the liberal democratic states whereby we're not taking care of these migrants, these poor migrants that are coming in through Belarus. We should go and help them. And so I think rogue states are very, very aware that they can leverage this against liberal democracies.
I want to make a parallel with one of the last big refugee crises we had, or migrant crisis we had in Europe back in 2015, because most of the people right now between Belarus and Poland are not from Belarus; they are Kurdish, and they are essentially imported in Belarus, and Belarus is using them as pressure on Europe. These Kurds have a tragic fate, but as it is nowadays, they are not eligible for asylum in the EU. And in many ways, it's quite comparable to what we saw in 2015, where 10-15% maybe were actually fleeing war and would qualify as refugees back then. But most of them were kind of economic migrants, and they were not eligible. But given the kind of pressure that Jorge just mentioned on kind of liberal democracies, the kind of moral cudgel you were describing, we accepted them. And what I find is really interesting is how much the discourse has shifted to the right since 2015. Because what Germany is saying nowadays is not "Wir schaffen das," we can do it, let's welcome everyone in, it will be fine. What the Germans, the very same CDU is saying nowadays is, and I'm going to be quoting from the General Secretary of the CDU, he said, "Poland is not only protecting the Polish border, it is also protecting the borders of the European Union. Therefore, Warsaw has the right to claim solidarity from Berlin and from Brussels." It's kind of a remarkable evolution from a party that accepted 1 million refugees or migrants back in 2015. It really shows how far the discourse has changed. But I think another dimension which is really interesting is this specific migrant crisis has made everyone uncomfortable for different reasons. It has made people in the EU very uncomfortable because they were having a face down with Poland over the rule of law and the rest of it. And now they just kind of begrudgingly have to accept they should shoulder to shoulder with Poland on this issue. So that's the first thing. Secondly, people on the right and the kind of far right as well, which are usually very anti-migrant, are very also uncomfortable with this story because it's Belarus and Russia behind it pushing this crisis on the border. So it's really a case of everyone being really uncomfortable with what's going on. You've got kind of center-left liberals who are kind of usually very pro-immigration, who are all of a sudden very uncomfortable because I understand this is kind of hybrid war waged by Russia. And on the same hand, you have people on the right and far right who are usually very anti-immigration, but also sympathetic to Russia and want to build closer relations to. And now all of a sudden have to be in a comfortable situation of refusing these migrant flows, but also not blaming Russia for it.
Mm.
Yeah, I think one thing as well, and you're talking about the normalization of this harder anti-immigration rhetoric, is the extent to which conversations around border walls. I mean, we all remember the outrage and backlash when then candidate Donald Trump talked about putting a wall on the border with Mexico. But today you're seeing countries across the EU, including Greece, asking the European Commission for funds to build border fencing and to make walls to keep out migrants. And it's become a sort of norm of immigration policy for several countries across the European Union.
Well, yeah, I think Greece should run, we'll have a candidate running as build a wall and Turkey will pay for it, or something along those lines. And you were mentioning Turkey early on. And I think what we're seeing is the EU is increasingly capable of being blackmailed by these kind of outside actors. And on many fronts, and there's going to be a very interesting segue to the next topic soon, but on immigration with Turkey and now Belarus, and they've been using that to pressure us.
And I thought it was so interesting when you were talking earlier, Francois, about the tenor of the conversation on Poland essentially shifting rapidly from condemnation of the Polish Constitutional Court ruling to full-throated support of Poland as it defends the EU's external border. But what I thought so interesting, I mean, I remember we did the episode that we did early on in season 1 with Daniel Fried, the former ambassador, former U.S. ambassador of Poland, Daniel Fried, former U.S. ambassador of Poland, who essentially said, yes, of course, the liberal left in countries like the U.S. and the U.K. can have a lot of qualms about Poland. Obviously, the government party is a sort of nationalistic party, the Law and Justice Party. But at the end of the day, Ambassador Fried said the following: we can get on with the Poles.
Yeah.
Essentially, Poland is such an important country to the West at large that no matter the qualms on specific areas of policy with the government, essentially at the end of the day, we all come around to this view that Poland is just so important as a geopolitical actor. I mean, it's strategically located, obviously, as near to Russia, but also a very strong supporter of the transatlantic alliance. So there's no way, there's no denying that.
So, there's one thing that I think it was Francois you mentioned on Russia's role in this. I don't know that Lukashenko funneling Kurdish migrants towards the Polish border and Lithuanian borders is necessarily in Russia's interest, because it's hardened the solidarity between Brussels and the more distant Eastern Central European states, where there's usually something of a disconnect. There's a lot more solidarity that you're seeing in terms of the statements and then the proposals for action. So I'm not necessarily sure that, I mean, Lukashenko is something of a wild card in a lot of his actions. You mentioned it with his kidnapping of a blogger from a jet. It doesn't seem something that would necessarily benefit Russia to be causing a crisis on the border, that it's leading these countries to turn to Brussels and to increase European solidarity.
No, but it's Russia's a patron.
Yes. But they're a patron, but I don't, this isn't something I think Putin would want to do.
No.
If you're trying to destabilize Poland, I don't think you would call Lukashenko and say, let's start funneling.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. But Russia gives Lukashenko the security he needs to be able to do reckless things like that.
Right, yes.
But I want to go back to my kind of segue, which I thought was really neat. So please do not interrupt my segue. There are many different issues on which outside powers have blackmail, essentially, on Europe. On immigration with Turkey, we saw that with how they can funnel, they can threaten to funnel immigrants into Europe. There's also the whole kind of Turkish community in Germany being very nationalistic and potentially could cause trouble. But this is one issue. Second issue, which is kind of trade. Again, with Germany, whenever you'd get Trump or the Chinese premier threatening to put tariffs on cars, mostly, Germany would fold. So there's kind of other area in which we were very much dependent. And there's a third area in which we are dependent, and that's my segue, it's on energy. Because we are so dependent on Russian gas that essentially that's another way we get blackmailed by foreign powers. And this is my segue. We are now going to move in the whole energy crisis, because right now there is massive energy crisis. I think there's been a 450% price increase in energy costs since January, which is ludicrous. Why? Because essentially, well, first of all, there's the COVID recovery, so there's a huge increase in demand, and so that's kind of, there's not much we can do about it. But more generally, we've realized that 90% of our natural gas is imported in the EU. And nearly half of that gas comes from Russia. So what Russia is doing is through Gazprom essentially will give us, will fulfill its contracts. We've got contracts with Gazprom, and Gazprom is still providing the energy it is contracting. But there's been a huge market liberalization of the energy market in the past decade or so. And now we rely a lot more on the spot purchases of gas. And so what this means is Gazprom and Russia is essentially stopping those on-the-spot market purchases, which means we are hugely dependent on Russia, and we're realizing right now there's not much we can do. And we are realizing how much leverage the Russians have. So we're realizing all across Europe that we are in a tough pot, and I think Spain are actually starting to put some price control measures over the past few weeks because they're realizing it could be an issue. But there's another kind of cause to this entire ruckus right now. And on the record, I think one, if not more, European countries will have a blackout. Will be on the verge of a blackout this winter. Usually, we manage to stockpile of energy for the winter, but right now the stockpiles are pretty low, and we are not used to that. Usually, we are able to do pretty well before winter, and this time we've been running out before the winter. So, if it's a cold winter, especially, it's going to be a really, really tough time. But something else we have to realize is we are also going in Europe through a phase of environmental transition. We are relying a lot less on gas, a lot less on coal than before. And so we are trying to push for renewables. The issue is renewables aren't that reliable. When there's no sun or no wind, we can't rely on them. And they haven't been able to pick up as much as we wanted to. At the same time, we have this kind of German fear of nuclear, which means they've abandoned all their nuclear plants. And I think Belgium has followed the lead and also seem to be banning their nuclear plants. France nearly went that way, but we are kind of pivoting away from the kind of discourse which was dominant in the 2010s. And as a result now, we are realizing that the environmental transition we touted for obvious reasons, we need to do it. We completely underestimated the kind of costs it would have. And I think we saw that coming with the Gilets jaunes crisis. And this is a topic we will actually dive in more details in the future. This kind of tension between can we have the cost of this environmental transition in a democracy? Can a government shoulder not only the kind of financial cost, but also the democratic cost of saying to everyone, well, we are not paying enough for energy in our day-to-day life. We need to, I think on average, Europeans pay less than 5% of their income on energy, which is in the kind of grand scheme of things, not much. If we are serious about the transition, it's going to have to cost us a lot more. And I think people are not realizing it. And I'm really thinking, to what extent can we do that transition in a kind of liberal regime, or to what extent are we going to have to kind of have a much more authoritarian or aristocratic approach to politics for us to implement this grand scheme? And it was really interesting, actually. GB News, which is not doing too hot, but when it still had the great Andrew Neil on the show, actually had Rishi Sunak come talk about whatever Rishi Sunak talks about when you're the Chancellor. But one of the questions I thought was really interesting was on the environmental transition process that the UK is going through. And it was really interesting because usually when Rishi Sunak talks to the press in this kind of situations, the question he will always get from journalists saying is, we're not going far enough. Do you think we're going far enough? Why 2015 or not 2014? And so on and so on. But for once, Andrew Neil took the opposite stance, saying, okay, well, you're saying this is going to cost X amount for the British taxpayer, for British gas buyer every month. This is going to be an extra £100 here and £100 here. And Sunak was really uncomfortable because all of a sudden he has to pivot his defense, saying, well, actually, it's not going to be that impactful. Whereas when he has to talk to a kind of more centre-left leaning journalist, he has to say, well, actually, we are very bold and ambitious. So I thought it was really, really interesting that we're not thinking about this in political terms, because the implications for our finances, for our energy, but also for our democracy, I think is huge.
I think, one thing, this might be a bold statement to make. I do think the decision by Germany to abandon nuclear power will go down as one of the worst policy decisions of the last decade. The reasoning for it, and there was a panel at the COP26 conference. Gillian Tett of the Financial Times was interviewing the head of the IAEA, and she was pushing the head of the IAEA on nuclear power and suggesting that it wasn't a safe alternative, and cited the Fukushima disaster, to which I think I can't remember his name or her name, said no people had died from radiation poisoning at Fukushima. I think one person has, and it was quite recently.
And it was like 80 plus or something, I think.
Yes. No one died. And I think France's leadership on nuclear energy and really pushing the European Commission to get that in. Obviously, nuclear plants take a long time to build. And there's another, you've talked about blackmail. The only countries really with expertise on building nuclear plants are Russia, China, the French, I guess South Korea as well. But there aren't many friendly nations that have that expertise on how to build up these reactors. So although it's a long-term energy solution, it still makes you reliant on the kindness of strangers.
No, absolutely. And I saw the interview talking about, and when he says Fukushima hasn't killed anyone, the entire audience bursts out laughing. It is the most awkward scene, and he just kind of stops and kind of chads it and says, "Yeah, absolutely, no one died. Here's the data." I think we have to realize any energy source we will be using has a cost. Nuclear has a cost, which is mainly the kind of nuclear debris. Nuclear debris.
Nuclear is a PR problem.
Nuclear waste. But like it's a big issue, and we're not really sure what to do with it. Undeniably, we're digging in very deep. But at the same time, I think if you put all the nuclear waste of France since the 1950s, I think you can fill a Olympic pool, which is a lot, but also kind of the grand scheme of things, not that much, to be fair. So it definitely has disadvantages with kind of physical risks and so on, undeniably. But I think if we are serious about this whole environmental transition on the European scale, we have to be serious about nuclear. And that's something actually which France has been trying to do, saying, okay, we've got an energy crisis, and at the same time, there's become this demonization of nuclear power in the past decade, mainly because Germany has kind of been pushing that kind of demonization after it decided to leave nuclear. But I think what's quite clear is no one in Europe actually agrees on what to do, or in the EU, nobody in the EU actually agrees what to do on energy. The French want the price of energy to be closer to the price of production in each country. Obviously, since France is producing very cheap nuclear energy, they're quite interested in that. Spain has been pushing grouped gas purchases, but nobody wants that because they think it's too messy and unwieldy. But Spain thinks it'd be a good idea because it would allow us to kind of buy at a cheaper price. But I think Poland and Hungary want to get rid of carbon quotas. They're like, this is an opportunity. We might as well throw this in. But what I think is quite clear, nobody agrees on anything, and I think we will go to the brink of chaos in January or something before anything gets done. Because I think people don't realize, but we are on the verge of a major catastrophe, and either we will be bought out by the Russians, who will give us a juicy deal in exchange of political compromises. Or we find a solution, but I think right now it's looking like we're heading straight into chaos.
I mean, what's the line from Richard III? Now is the winter of our discontent.
Yes,
that's very much what we're facing. And you mentioned with the Gilets jaunes, the political ramifications from this in the way that a fuel crisis or blackouts across major countries in Europe can spiral very quickly into mass political protests and movements against incumbent powers, and the potential that has for destabilizing the politics of certain countries. Obviously, France has an election coming up next year. It's not going to be a sort of a one winter of higher energy prices and blackouts and some tough problems. This is going to be something that has a ripple effect for years down the line in terms of its effect on European policy and European leadership. Yeah,
especially because one of the first thing the Greens, the Liberals, and the Social Democrats in Germany agreed on in their coalition agreement was actually accelerating the end of coal energy in Germany, which is only going to make that coal energy is obviously horrible for environmental reasons, but it's not going to make our energy situation much better. And I think there's a really absence of thinking on kind of political terms of all this. But I think Julian's winter of discontent was a great place to conclude on. Thanks a lot, Julian. Thanks a lot, Jorge. Thanks a lot for all of you for sticking around for this bonus episode, this medley of topics. And I guess see you next week. Oh, also, don't forget, if you like the show, you can support us on our Patreon. And currently, we have a few patrons, very generous patrons. Thank you to all of you. We would like in the future, if we have enough of you, to actually give you special content, special episodes, maybe longer episodes, interact with you more. So we are, I think, close to that kind of threshold. But if you guys want to join us and be part of the Uncommon Decency Patreon and the Uncommon Decency adventure, we would love to have you with us. So with that said, thank you, Julian, and thank you, Jorge, and see you next week.